Hi, excuse me. Yes, I'm Katie Keeler from Collider. So Collider, along with Watershed, produce Creative Technology Network. And like everyone else, I'm going to call it SWOOCTON from now on. So what do we bring to the partnership as producers? What is the role of the producer in art and technology innovation? What difference do they make? And what is a producer anyway? Before we bring in our three brilliant producer fellows, I just want to share a few ideas with you. I am a producer with over 25 years experience in arts and culture. So I have produced theatre and circus and dance and installation and live art and things. And at first, I was a bit skeptical about what my experience could bring to a programme to build innovation capacity. However, my experience combined with the expertise at Collider and with the brilliant and super experienced team at Watershed, I think now give me a unique insight into what I can bring. And so I want to share that today about what producing for innovation is and how doing it well can make a real difference. So I'm going to simplify and just go down to producing. I understand that as a producer, I am a facilitator, a spreadsheet lover, a grant writer, and a cheerleader. A good way to visualize the actual practice of producing, though, is through the Collider triangle, which I'm going to share with you now. So the Collider producing triangle. Collider is a production studio founded by artist Seth Honor and is home to a resident community of creative practitioners and creative individuals and companies. We produce artworks that invite audiences to think about the world, and we run programs in art and technology that help others to do that too. And we recognize that this pattern, this model, this triangle, could be applied to everything we produce. On the one corner, you'll see context, and then on the other, idea. And at the top, you have money or resource. So, idea. At Collider, we'd normally start with the idea, and that would normally be an idea for an artwork. But no matter how good that idea is, that idea for that artwork is, it's nothing on its own. We have to get it out there into the world. It has to meet people. And so for that, we need context. Context. Often with an artwork, this means a market that we can sell the artwork to, or people that can benefit from it. But it can be so much bigger than this. As Professor John Dovey said this morning, context is what your idea is for in this point of history. What does it change? How does that very specific idea and context come together to amplify and impact each other? And the pound sign is obvious, is for resource or money. Until we come up with something better, we mostly do need money to make things happen. So, excuse me, so we pay attention to how the idea, context, and resource are connected. And the sweet spot is right in the center of the triangle. This is where we make meaning and where we make value. Sorry. So bringing the idea and the context together into the center of the triangle is the job of the producer. And you can see that we need all 3 points. If the context is really strong, but you don't have the ideas or the money, it falls flat. You and I could decide to go on a walk together. We could make that happen pretty easily. And at that point, we exist on that line between idea and context. But if you and I want to make a piece of innovation together, I think we're going to need some money. You can't exist on the line between money and idea because without a context, it sort of doesn't exist. And context without money needs ideas. It's about getting off the lines and out of the corners and being in the center. So the forces holding this triangle together are working like gravity, and this can tell you important things about your project. You can feel when the money is pulling it out of balance, or when the idea and the context don't quite fit, for example. Sometimes money and context come in heavily, and then the task in hand is to find the ideas. If money with loads of strings attached has a massive impact on the idea, that's not necessarily a good environment for innovation. So the producer's job is to coax the dot into the middle. The producer is both the medium and the method for holding that meaningful position. But of course, it's not just about doing the job, it's about how we do it. And the way we do it is important. What is the best way to get a bird from one side of the room to the other? Well, the most efficient way is to tie the bird to a rock and throw it. A better way is to open a window. So how do we produce well in innovation? What ingredients do we need to make the meaning and value and to play the long game for real change? In our projects, in our businesses, in the world. So I'm going to go for 3 ingredients. 1, nerve for the new. 2, relationality. And 3, care. So 1, nerve for the new, something we talk about at Collider quite a bit. And it's something I've realized I bring with me from arts and culture. It's about being able to change quickly, to pivot, to let go of ideas, even if you're really invested in them. It's about personal resilience, I think, and emotional intelligence, but mostly agility and adaptability. So if it's the producer's job to create context and money, then nerve for the new is sometimes about spotting that those things are down the line and holding them there. And so that you can trust the idea and the knowledge held in the brilliant people, whether they are an individual or a network like ours. As Charlie Tapp, head of programs at Collider, says, a producer is a person or a place that holds risk. In Swookton, the producers try to make space for all the weight and the power of the universities, and then Research England, and then ultimately industrial strategy money from government. They try and hold back this pressure from the people doing the innovating. If you don't create the conditions, it creates friction for everyone. So that's nerve for the new. The second one is relationality. The role of the producer is all about people and the connections between them. It's about listening, trusting, translating between sectors, gearing between powers, selling, persuading, and the brokering and the connection of people can result in great collaborations. I think it's about getting good people in the room. And number 3 is care. So when you've got these good people in the room, it's about doing your very best to try and flatten hierarchy and to take good care of them. When I asked around about what a producer is, about what is a producer, I heard, oh, it's a project manager who cares and a person who cares beyond reason. And Jo Lansdowne, executive producer at Watershed, I've heard her say that a conversation about producing is always fascinating because it becomes a conversation about power. And that to produce well, you need to seek out people with a different vantage point from your own. And I think that's hardwired in at Pervasive Media Studio at Watershed. They have a culture of generosity, curiosity, and interruptibility. They believe that by clustering people together from a broad range of backgrounds with differing skills and experiences and opinions, everyone's ideas get better. So there is always learning when thinking about care and I wish I could say I'd always done it brilliantly. And as we all get better at filling rooms with people who don't look or think like each other, then this learning increases. So number 3 is care about people and care about power. And really, those are the same things. So if a producer combines the collider-producing triangle with the 3 ingredients, nerve for the new, relationality, and care, and if you think of the triangle as a kind of map and the 3 ingredients as the attitude with which you pass through that terrain, then hopefully you, the producer, create the conditions for innovation. Let's not tie a rock to a bird, let's open a window. And by navigating this terrain in this way, I think we get right to the heart of what Swukten is. It's the attitude and the behaviour and the process. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our Swukten Producer Fellows. And these fellowships were short fellowships, and they were about exploring the role of the producer in art and technology innovation from 3 very different perspectives. We asked them, what's new, what's interesting, where are the gaps in the market? And their focus was very much on Devon and Cornwall, which are the most southwest of the southwest of England. We were particularly interested in the opportunities and challenges of producing in a more rural location. So please come up here with me.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Hello.
Hey, it's Gary and Chris. And so I'm going to just introduce you. Sorry if that's embarrassing. So, hey, Anne-Marie's just joined us. So Anne-Marie Culhane's background is as a practitioner who initiates, catalyzes, designs and delivers creative and environmental arts projects. And she has used her learning from her newest project, Tidelines, specifically, exploring community and civic engagement at a time of climate and ecological emergency. Kerry Deacon's practice is as a creative producer, community filmmaker, facilitator, and project manager in the innovation and sustainability sector. And Chris Hunt is a creative technologist who works across sectors in cultural, social, and commercial settings. Thank you so much, you 3. I want to start, to get us going, just to ask you all to reflect on the role of the producer from your perspective.
Okay.
Anyone want to jump in? Anne-Marie, can I go to you first?
Yeah, well, I was just so full of stuff that you've been saying just now, and I was just thinking about my practice in the context of the idea, context, resource triangle that you're talking about, and how, for me, I guess all of my work comes from, in a sense, the context. So I'm thinking about not only this moment in history, but I'm also, because I've got an ecological framing for all of my practice, I'm thinking about this moment in Earth's history. And when I'm thinking about an audience, I'm thinking about who can benefit in terms of people or communities. I work really closely with communities, particularly on this project, Guidelines. But I'm also viewing communities as all the other being, or as many of the other beings that I can find out about who co-inhabit that space with us. So for me, communities is more than humans as well as humans. So I'm interested in how we kind of put another circle around that frame, which goes beyond society into ecology and into earth living systems. So that's sort of a broader frame that I try and kind of use as a lightning rod through all of my production collaborations, down to the very materials I use and where I work and how I work and who I work with. Are those ecological considerations that are kind of, they're hardwired into the kind of practice I have.
Thank you. And Chris, working in as a creative technologist, I think you'll have come across so many different people that maybe do that producing function that are cool things that I wouldn't recognize maybe, but I wondered about your impressions of what a producer's role is.
To me, a producer, you might call them a manager or an agile coach or a scrum master. They're someone who makes the conditions for innovation. So they are someone who does all the paperwork, moves things out the way, picks the right people for the room, but also kind of holds the money and holds the budget and is in charge of how everything is kind of wrapped and timescaled and all put together. So it's important for them to be kind of aware and considerate of everything they're doing and this space they're creating. So like you were saying before, with that idea of value and care, in order to ensure that room is diverse and full of the right mix of voices you need, it's on the producer to create that, to bring those people to it and use their position of power to really make that happen and to really make those projects and work happen, and to push innovation and to push ideas and to get the people who are working on something together to really think more and think bigger or in different directions. And it's a big role for someone to take on, but I think the right kind of work, the right kind of person suits this role and really develops stuff, really allows people to develop really amazing, interesting work.
And Kerry, I think our idea of producer might be the most similar out of the four of us, but I think you're particularly interested in the relationality, the connections between people. But any reflections you've got about the role?
I was picking up on the three kind of descriptors that you gave in terms, the four descriptors that you gave in terms of your work, and I think out of all of my work that I've done in community filmmaking, in working as a teacher, working with artists, or working in the innovation and sustainability sector, I feel there's a thread of facilitation that sits quite heavily within the role of a producer, and facilitating those relationships to support people to come together and how people come together. And what I feel I'm very interested in is the personality of that role of the producer, and how they hold that space for creativity, but how they hold that space for multiple people to come together from different backgrounds, different kind of work frameworks and the ways in which people work to kind of manifest an idea into reality.
Great. Yes, and Anne-Marie, you're an expert at that, I think, aren't you? Bringing people from very, very different disciplines together, all those strands together, and flattening the hierarchy somehow. Do you think you do that? And would you talk about?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think the kind of joining things up is a fundamental part of kind of this producer role, creative thinker, whatever we want to call it. But yeah, for the moment we're calling it producer role, where you're literally trying to bind things back together again that have been broken apart and in silos. And of course those are necessary to get depth of knowledge, but I think the producer is someone that maybe, well, in my case, darts between those different spaces and draws together and weaves together the threads, and sometimes it looks beautiful and sometimes it's a bit messy and frayed. But it's kind of putting the world back together again thing that's happening. And in terms of how that happens, for example, I'm working in a really local context in Exmouth and in the Ex Estuary, and there's so much knowledge in this estuary, and it's loads of the knowledge is up the road at Exeter University. Loads of the knowledge is in the people that have lived here, the boat builders that have lived here for 68 or maybe their whole lives, who know the ebb and flow of the movement of the estuary, how it's changing. So how do we put all those different forms of knowledge together, and where it's not in a kind of conventional format of someone speaking, someone responding, whereas that's a really active dialogue, which is generative. And there's also people here that have probably been here for a year that have a particular perspective that to bring. So what I'm trying to always do is create spaces where those different forms of knowledge can interact, and you don't ever know what's going to come out of that. So it's quite an emergent process as well, and often it's quite unpredictable, which is also doesn't necessarily fit with the way that we look at experimental learning, because there's often no fixed outcomes. You don't know quite where something's going to go, but it's really, really fun and interesting, and that's what I like to do.
That sounds like that is the space for innovation, though. Yeah. Chris, you were nodding. Do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Yeah, and it's always interesting. The way I think about a lot of these kind of spaces for innovation is we kind of create playgrounds, but we're not just operating in our own playground that we make. In technology, we're kind of working in playgrounds that are created by Apple and Google and Microsoft and all these organizations we don't really have any control over, but we can kind of be this kind of edge person sitting in and kind of pushing things and pushing the boundaries of what we can do. And that's where the really interesting, exciting stuff happens, where I feel the real innovative work can start becoming and start being there, where it really starts to challenge and really works through what these situations can be.
And you were all looking specifically at Devon and Cornwall, and I know place is just quite important to all of you. I wondered about some of the opportunities and challenges you found in this, sort of in that region, in the southwest. Kerry, anything?
I was actually listening to Roop earlier on in the Year of Automation session, and kind of he mentioned, and I may be paraphrasing Roop, sorry, about the value of the Swicton network in supporting automation and supporting artists. And I think I live in Devon, I live in rural Devon, a minute away from Dartmoor. And the context of my work is understanding the networks that are in Devon and Cornwall to support producers and to support producers, to support artists, support cultural organisations, to support new work, to support new innovation, and how we can make producers more who live in rural areas more visible.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I live in Devon, but I guess I'm looking at that within the context of an estuary, within the context that many of the world's cities are built on estuaries. So there's a sort of scale, it's just a scale thing here, and it feels like the work that we're doing here could potentially be of interest and relevance to other estuary dwellers. So it doesn't feel like we're just making work here, and I'm really interested in this hyper-local and global resonance that I can try and bring into the work, where some of the lessons and the learning can be applied across different scales, but actually the work takes place in a really engaged way, really locally. And then you can take patterns or blueprints from how that work takes place, and perhaps you can draw on those in other places. So it kind of doesn't feel that rural, or yeah, it's an interesting question, because I kind of don't necessarily think of myself as being particularly rural, but yeah, I know I am.
I like the challenge. Maybe it's the wrong word. Yeah. And Chris, do you train it up to London quite a lot, or do you work in the region?
I do train up to London, but I also do a lot of work in Devon and Cornwall. And what I find in Devon and Cornwall is that there's a lot of both artists and organisations that can really support lots of interesting small projects or small interventions. People who are willing to try new things and explore and experiment. And that is really a massive asset to the Southwest. And thinking in places like Plymouth, there's nudge communities who have supported loads of artists around Union Street to make stuff and transform the area, but also working with new technologists who really bring and enhance that work through things like AR and augmented reality. And in rural settings, distance is going to be an issue. Especially in the south, especially in somewhere like Cornwall, where it's several hours to travel across. And the value of grassroots communities, especially to kind of the technology community in the Southwest, is huge, with things like Tech Exeter, Digital Plymouth, Kernodat, and things going on in Cornwall. Those are hugely beneficial, and lots of new talent and young people have come through those programs and really developed new stuff, and have also, more importantly, stayed in the Southwest and become part of the community and really developed, so we don't end up with that brain drain up to Bristol and London as well. And that's been really great. And even with this current situation, that's continued. Those events, those things have continued digitally online, as evidenced with things like this. And that's been really great. And that's really positive. And that makes me feel really strongly that Devon and Cornwall has a place for innovation. It's a place where things are happening and things are being creative and exciting, and that really makes me feel good.
Classic on mute. I just wanted to touch on the difficulties that we've had. I think it has been a tricky time, particularly with your research, Kerry, to be able to get hold of independent producers, because everyone's got a lot going on. Yeah,
I'm very aware of the pandemic and the challenges that has brought up for the arts and cultural industry, and aware of people losing work. That's independent producers losing work. That's also producers who are within a role within a cultural organisation. So I felt a time to, when is a good time to talk about producing? I think there's never a bad time to talk about producing, but in the context of what's been happening, it's been a bit of a challenge. And I know that for me and the work that I'm doing, and producers that I'm connecting with, hearing how they're slowly picking up work, starting to consider where the new opportunities are, which is what a producer does, what a producer looks for, and ways in which they can engage with each other.
Can I ask you about surprises that you found in your research? Anything that you hadn't expected? Anne-Marie?
Well, I guess just following on from Kerry a little bit about that question, my year's been radically changed by the pandemic, and because many of the methods that I use have had to, we've had to use much more creative thinking online as part of Tidelines with how we do initial engagement, which we would always do face to face. So that sort of pushed me into really having to think about, well, what is involved here in building a sort of technology-based relationship with a new audience that I haven't even met, which is something that I would potentially do as a follow-up, not as a primary initial interaction. So that's been really surprising, and I'm not quite finished learning about that yet. I still feel like we're in that phase. And what else has been surprising? I guess, I don't know. I have to think a bit more about that. Right, come back to me.
Anything that surprised you in your research?
Yeah, I think when I started thinking about things like, Agile and Scrum and all these kind of different methodologies that are coming out of the technology world to describe ways of managing people and processes and getting things to happen. And kind of what I've discovered, both through kind of experiences and talking and interviewing people, is all those things are just ideas. They're just ways of managing people, ways of making things happen. They don't create the innovation. They don't make the new stuff happen. And they're just things that you can apply to a workplace. So there is no right answer about what format of working will fit your project. And very often each project will need a different way of working, a different way of making space and making thoughts and ideas and things come to fore. And what I've learned from my own work is the real value of me as a technologist, trying to be as improvisational as possible, trying to think not in terms of big systems and big ideas, but as in smaller, more achievable and measurable steps, and really focusing on that and allowing the work and collaborations with artists and producers to really flow from there, flowing from smaller steps, one thing coming in after, almost like the way you think how jazz comes together or improvisational dance, or those kind of formats where it's about being in a space and bouncing off of each other. And that's a really exciting way to work, an exciting way to think about it. I think is where the real innovation starts to happen, is when you have that kind of social aspect it's not just one genius in a room, it's people together, and again, going back to the producer, making that room happen. And that makes really exciting and really interesting work. And I think there's more space to do that. But the surprise for me was that there is no right answer for what shape that space is. It all depends on the people and the project and who's there as well.
Thank you, Chris. Kerry?
I think surprises in my research are definitions and roles of producer. And I think our expectations is not the right word. I think understanding what an independent producer thinks of their practice, whether they sit in and across technology, or they sit across theatre, or they sit across live art or inclusion, understanding that definition and that role of that producer. And then the context of a producer who is actually attached to a cultural organisation, and what the cultural organisation ethos is and approaches are, and how that is imbued into the role of the producer as well. I think that's been an interesting throw up of different perspectives and challenges and understandings of our practice, really. And I also feel the surprise for me is, and a concept that I'm thinking around, is how we can produce for producers and networks for producers. Producers sit within the networks of artists, within the networks of cultural institutions and funders, but how we can support producers to sit within a network ourselves and care for ourselves and learn amongst ourselves. And for me, in the research around who's working in that space in Devon and Cornwall, it'd be interesting to kind of look at that work and as Anne-Marie was saying around estuaries, the work that she's doing, how to replicate that, or how to kind of consider how to move that work forward, I suppose. I think that's been two interesting things that have come forward for me.
Yeah.
Can I add one more thing? I was just thinking about how I'm really curious, and maybe this is a bit of a plug for the next session, for arts organisations, arts producers that are working on this edge between place, community, creative technology and ecology and climate emergency. I actually haven't had I've put quite a lot of calls out and put feelers out to find people, and there's still things coming back, and there's a couple of Swipton fellows that I'm in dialogue with who I think there could be some really fantastic collaborations. But I guess I'm still trying to find a little bit of a tribe, or whether there is a tribe in that work. And also very quickly is that I guess in terms of supporting other producers to make contact with academics. So I've had incredible support from academics across quite a few different institutions, and really pretty much every call that I've put out to an academic to collaborate or explore an idea has been positive. So I think maybe at this moment, maybe it's the subject matter that I'm exploring, but there's a real keenness and enthusiasm. I'm also having quite a few academics or researchers come to Tidelines to use that as a platform to step into the public realm for the first time, and that's kind of exciting as well. So
you've made me think a lot of things all at once. I can't get them out in the right order, but yes, I think the idea that that the producer is pretty agile, and I know all three of you really are. That you're adaptable, and actually, and I've talked about the agility and adaptability that Watershed and Collider have needed within the Swipton programme, and that helps because we're tiny compared to, well, Collider is tiny compared to university, and yet Kerry and Anne-Marie, you're individuals quite often, or you're working with individuals, and so that strength in that person, you can see the big picture, but also, like you say, Kerry, how to support them, because it can be a pretty lonely, difficult place, and the wrestling with the power can get you down.
Definitely. Yeah. No, I was just picking up on that isolation of that space of where that producer can sit. You are that person that is holding that space for multiple people to engage together. And I think it's about how, for me anyway, how producers can leverage our skills amongst each other to support each other a little bit more. I think that's definitely something to make our work more visible. Sometimes the unsung heroes of work that's been produced, but also to kind of how we can put ourselves more on the map, really.
I know that this is something in your work, Anne-Marie, that you are navigating between so different, much bigger organisations quite often, pulling them together and seeing the big picture. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit more about what you said in your first answer about the ecologies. This is about ecologies. This is about systems, isn't it? It's producing lark.
Yeah, and it also, just sort of picking up on what Carrie was saying, it can feel incredibly lonesome, particularly this last year, and particularly if you're taking a risk and stepping into a new area and trying out some new things in a time where everything's new and everything's unstable. So that has been a particular challenge of now, and that's where Kerry's network would be amazing. Yeah, I'm just trying to think about your a way into your question. Katie, can you say a bit more?
Wait, maybe. Oh, sorry, Kerry, go ahead.
Well, I'm just looking at the ecology of who we are, and people and places and locations where work takes place, and locations where producers exist, and the cultural organisations that are based in the southwest in Devon and Cornwall, and feeding into a future network, and that future kind of collaboration of that would support more ideas coming forward, more innovation, and yeah.
I think I can now go. I was just thinking about, I mean, the Southwest is really well supported in terms of like the Met Office, Exeter Uni, Plymouth Uni, a lot of coastal observatories, a lot of people that are looking at the natural environment and natural ecology, and looking at environmental perspective, but also in terms of business and tourism. And so there's all these big players, and then there's independent small organizations, or in our case 2 people, who are trying to work with those sort of sources of energy, power, money, but also trying to really connect on the ground to the grassroots, to people who might have never had, who you're having to change languages, you're having to translate things all the time into more common ways of communicating, because we use such special languages when we're talking in these kind of settings. So that role feels sort of, I don't know, I guess it'd be interesting to talk to someone in a system, like what that actual role is in a bigger system, that sort of translator, transformer, and also I think allowing more access, because I think a lot of things are framed as coming from universities or institutions or through the arts, even, or arts audiences are very specific.
I think
we try and grow them all the time, but ultimately, that I know in my town there's going to be a lot of people that if I say it's an arts event, they won't come to it. I have to frame it in a completely different way. So I'm always reframing things.
Reframing. And I just want to make sure we have sort of trailed your 3 o'clock session. So at 3 o'clock, these guys are in one of the sessions, and you can hear more about their research. And so Anne-Marie can tell you more about the interdisciplinary response to climate emergency and ecological breakdown, methods of community engagement, place and creative technology through the project Tidelines. But also would love to hear from you about what you're doing. And Kerry's been exploring the creative producer landscape in Devon and Cornwall, so is very keen to hear what practices out there, insights, challenges, and ambitions. And Chris, I think you're keen to explore, really best practice in creative technology projects, and and how a technologist, you know, as working as a technologist, you can bridge with other sectors. Would you say this was a fair description of what we'll be talking about at 3 o'clock?
Yes, absolutely.
That's brilliant. So just to finish, is there anything that I haven't asked that you wish I had asked because you've sort of thought about it and want to say it out loud now?
I think it's good to acknowledge in this role of producing in all sorts of sectors is almost the idea of the iceberg, that the kind of creative thing is the thing we see at the top poking above the water, and there is so much work that goes into that, all stuff that isn't seen and isn't visible, to make the magic happen in those moments as well. I think it's important with conversation like this and Kerry's network that we're kind of acknowledging that work and that kind of burden that we put on ourselves in that, and that work we pull together, and kind of the way we can support each other through that will grow and will allow us to kind of evidence that more and see that more. And I think that's a really positive step. Excellent.
Well, unless one of you jumps in, I'm going to say thank you ever so much for talking to us today. It's really great. And at 3 o'clock, you can find out lots more and talk loads more about producing.